Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So we have been talking about this process of mitosis, right? How do I take a single cell and make more cells from it? And we talked about the reasons that cells would decide to grow and make more of themselves. When we're talking about overarching processes, one of the reasons cells will go through cell division is for reproduction. Right? And that's true of prokaryotes, single celled, eukaryotes, multicellular, it doesn't matter. All right, every organism on Earth ultimately has to reproduce, and in order to do that, that means we have to make more cells. So the question then becomes, are they using mitosis to do it? Or we'll be getting into the next section shortly, where we'll talk about meiosis, and that's another strategy. Regardless of the actual mechanism, they all have to reproduce. So the other component to that is, do they reproduce on their own or do they need a partner? And that's the difference between asexual reproduction versus sexual reproduction. And that really then starts driving down to that question of, do I use mitosis to make more of myself, or am I going to need another process like meiosis to do it? So let's talk about the differences just in terms of sexual versus asexual. So when we look at asexual reproduction, this is typically where we're using mitosis or some version of that. And the reason is that we're taking a single parent and we're dividing that parent into two cells, all right, into two new organisms. And what that ends up doing is creating a clone. And so when we talk about clones, right, we're talking about cells that are genetically identical. All right. So we're creating not only offspring that are genetically identical to each other, but also genetically identical back to the parent. And so we're often using mitosis or some version of that in order to go through asexual reproduction. I want to maintain the genetic integrity of that cell in my offspring. So when we look at different strategies for how organisms go through asexual reproduction, one of the things we can look at is probably the most simplistic version of asexual reproduction. And that's what prokaryotes do, bacteria do. They undergo binary fission. And binary fission isn't true mitosis, right? Because remember, mitosis is the division of a nucleus. Prokaryotes don't have a nucleus. So this is sort of a evolutionary precursor process. This process would have evolved pre-mitosis because it's pre-nucleus. So prokaryotes will undergo binary fission, which is essentially what you're looking at over here. All right, where I take that parent cell, I go through DNA replication, I duplicate its chromosome. As that duplication is happening, those chromosomes are being pushed to opposite poles, and then the cell will undergo cytokinesis. All right, so cytokinesis still happens, but keep in mind that binary fission isn't true mitosis because there is no nucleus. They also don't use spindle fibers. There's no centrioles. There's none of that. All right, it's just duplicate the genetic information, go through cytokinesis, we're done. When I look at some eukaryotes, right, whether they are single-celled organisms or multicellular, now these guys will end up using mitosis because remember, eukaryote has a nucleus. Okay, so they can do this by a couple of different forms. One form of utilizing mitosis for asexual reproduction that we see in organisms like these little hydras here, which are little aquatic heterotrophs. They sort of look almost like little palm trees. They're really tiny. You can see them with the naked eye, but they don't look like much. Or yeast, right? These guys will actually go through mitosis to form these buds. And those buds will grow off the side of themselves via mitosis until they are mature enough to break off and then go off and do their own thing. But again, they are budding, They are organisms that are being produced asexually, and so they are genetically identical to any other bud that that parent cell might create or that parent organism might create. They are also genetically identical back to the parent itself. Another option, all right, still asexual reproduction, still using mitosis to do this, is this thing called fragmentation, where the parent will actually split into individual pieces, and those individual pieces then grow into new organisms. Planaria, which are these little flatworms, all right, again, kind of tiny. You can barely see them with your naked eye. You stick them under a dissecting scope, and they kind of look like this. Um, they also split via fragmentation. You can actually force it to happen if you know what you're doing. You can take a little razor blade and slit just a little bit out of their head, just a little bit out of the tail, so long as you don't mess with their primary neural cord here in the backbone of them. Then they will go ahead and start reproducing via fragmentation. They'll start splitting until you end up with two planaria out of it. Sea stars, same idea. They can lose components of their limbs so long as their sort of internal digestive and sort of neural net here in the center doesn't get majorly damaged. It's possible for them to also reproduce via fragmentation. In fact, that caused us quite a few problems. If you know anything about the big kelp forests, the big seaweed forests that exist in the oceans off the coast of places like Oregon and Washington, sea stars are very ferocious eaters of kelp. They love it. They'll devour it. And what we didn't understand initially when we started driving motorized boats through these kelp forests is that we were inadvertently chopping them up with our propellers. Right? We were forcing fragmentation of these guys to happen when we didn't actually kill them, and we caused their population to explode. And they were eating all of the kelp because the other organisms in their environment couldn't keep up with their reproduction. And so we had to ban motorized boats to go through these kelp forests because of what we were doing to their population size as a result of the fact that they reproduce by fragmentation. Okay, so we're going to look at this chart a couple of times. For today, we mostly focused on the ideas of asexual reproduction, right? Taking a single cell, duplicating its genetic information, allowing the cell to divide, and ultimately producing offspring that are genetically identical to each other and genetically identical to those parents, right? What we called clones. And so bacteria can do this via binary fission. The hydra and the yeast can do it via budding. Planaria, sea stars are some examples that do it via fragmentation, and some plants can actually do it if you go through and do cuttings. If you've ever seen something like a spider plant, if you don't know what I mean, go Google it. They actually produce little babies that come off of them, and you can cut those guys off, go plant them, you'll have a whole new spider plant. And those guys are reproducing via those little sort of buds that they produce, those cuttings that we can produce, that they are all genetically identical to each other and genetically identical back to the parent. Benefit there is that if it's working, right? So keep in mind that these guys down here are all doing this via mitosis. Okay. Remember, binary fission isn't true mitosis because they don't have a nucleus. Right? Those bacteria are prokaryotes. Okay. There's benefits and drawbacks to both of these strategies. When I look at asexual reproduction, right, the sort of benefit here on this side of the table is that I don't have to expend energy to go find a mate. Right? So I'm not wasting all this energy finding a mate, courting a mate, actually going through the mating process, right? I just get to a point where I am ready to reproduce. I produce my offspring, off we go. All right. The drawback here, though, goes back to evolution. All right. Remember that these guys are clones, right? They are genetically identical. So there's very little genetic variation, which ends up becoming a problem when we talk about natural selection, right? Remember that natural selection thrives on genetic variation. So if the environment changes, I need genetic variation. So hopefully there's some set of traits in there that allow us to adjust with that environment, right? If they're all genetically identical to each other and that environment shifts, we're no good, right? We're all going to end up dead. We're all going to end up extinct. That being said, if the environment is stable, you've got the right set of conditions, you're clearly living and surviving, so that could potentially be beneficial in the short term. We go over to sexual reproduction now, all right, and now I'm going to take two parents who are going to produce offspring, all right, and they're going to do this by joining their gametes, all right, and we'll talk about gametes. These are sex cells, all right, so your eggs and your sperm. And these guys are going to take half of the DNA from each parent, and as a result, the offspring are going to be genetically different from the parents. And we'll find as we talk through how sexual reproduction actually produces those gametes. Um, I should say that how organisms that undergo sexual reproduction produce those gametes. We're going to see that not only are the offspring different from the parents, but even from the same set of parents, the offspring are genetically different from each other too, right? So if you have full-blood siblings, you both have the same mom and dad, you aren't identical to your sibling either. All right, and there's going to be reasons for that. So a lot of multicellular animals, most plants, most things that kids think about. If I were to tell you list the first 5 organisms that come off the top of your head, they're probably going to be sexually reproducing organisms. And these guys are going to accomplish this via a process called meiosis. All right, and we're going to talk about that in the next set of notes. Now, again, remember I said there's benefits and drawbacks to both strategies. This is why evolutionarily they both exist. So the benefit of not finding or not using energy to find a mate in asexual reproduction is kind of the drawback to sexual reproduction, right? So when I look at this, I now have to expend energy to mate. Not only do I have to go out and search for a mate, I have to court that mate a lot of times. I have to go through the mating process. Just spend a couple of minutes at lunch or in the hallways over the next couple of days and just watch your peers and the amount of energy that you all spend trying to cozy up to somebody you are attracted to, right? It's kind of crazy. And yet we are biologically driven to do it. All right. At the end of the day, biology has evolved us to reproduce. Now, we as humans have some cultural expectations and moral expectations of when and how that should occur, but our biology underlying is get your genetics to the next generation. And to do that, you have to reproduce, you have to produce offspring. So lots of energy goes into that on sexual reproduction, but the benefit far outweighs that cost. And that benefit, that pro to sexual reproduction, lots of genetic variation. All right. So having all of that extra genetic variation when natural selection comes around because the environment's changing gives us a lot more options to potentially choose from and hopefully starves off the potential for the species to go